All right, so this is the intertestamental period, which is, again, the major changes between the start of the Second Temple, which is what we talked about last week with Ezra and Nehemiah. There's now a second temple that God has. And the beginning of the New Testament. So everything you need to know going into it so that you understand how the world has changed. So first of all, this is a period of 400 years where there's no more Bible being written at all. And the Jewish people actually believe there is no more Bible being written ever after this point. But we believe that we have a New Testament. And so this is before the New Testament, everything that happens. So first of all, we're going to talk about 5 categories. The categories are the changes in world empires. We're going to go from Persia, the Persian Empire, to the Roman Empire. We're going to talk about Judea, what happens in the history specifically of Judea, which is where the Jewish people have their homeland. And it's going to go from being a Persian province to being independent, completely free, and then to being a Roman province. And then we're going to talk about Second Temple Judaism, which is the shifts in the Jewish people's worldview, because there's some major changes in the way that people think. And then we're going to talk about John the Baptist, who's the guy who announces Jesus. He's the one that the prophet Malachi foretold, like we talked about last week. We're going to talk about his personal background, but also his impact on history, because he made a big impact on history, as you'll see, beyond just Christianity. And then we're going to talk about the Messiah, just a very quick review at the end there about how this is the person who's called the Christ, who's going to bring God's kingdom of the Garden of Eden, of paradise, to the world, and everybody's expecting that. So, first of all, world empires from Persia to Rome. So, remember as we talk about everything here, that the Jews are scattered all over the world at this point. So, all over the Western world that was popular at the time. So back then, their Americas were isolated and on their own. There was no America back then. Back then, it was all centered in Europe and Asia and Africa. So there's Jews on all 3 of those continents. So the Persian Empire lasts 220 years. And it starts with this guy, Cyrus the Great, we talked about. But then there's more kings. And eventually, there's this guy named King Xerxes. And he attempts to take control of the Greek lands, all the lands of the Greek peoples. He was only partially successful. Xerxes was defeated by an alliance between the originally divided Greek city-states known as Sparta and Athens. And if you've seen the movie 300, it's what it's kind of about. Xerxes is attacking the Greek people. Well, those Greek people die, but it was actually ends up being a victory later because of Athens. These events lead to many years of Greek civil wars between the city-states that competed for power. And this led to 4 successive but short-lived Greek empires, culminating with the greatest of them at the very end. So the Greek people were actually very divided. They weren't a united people. The only thing they shared and that unified them was a culture and a language. But they really cared about that language and culture. So the Athenian Empire is the first empire, which is the city of Athens. They take over everything. And then the Spartans are like, well, what about us? We helped defeat the Persians, so they take over everything. And then there's a Spartan Empire. And then there's a Theban Empire, this other random one. And then finally, the Macedonians are so tired of all this fighting, they come in and they're actually more smart about it through Alexander the Great. First, his father, actually, Philip II. But then his son, Alexander the Great, comes in. And he not only does he help conquer the rest of Greece, but he expands all the way across the ancient world, and he officially conquers the Persian Empire and unifies all the Greek peoples for a short time, because it only lasts 13 years. But that was the empire. It was a big one, but it was very short-lived. It's the life of a boy that just became a teenager, right? 13, and then it was done. Then after this, there's this division of this Greek empire, and it declines very slowly over time. So Alexander the Great, the guy who did this conquest, he was a very excellent conqueror, but he was a horrible administrator. He wasn't good at managing all the things that he had. So after his death, his greatest military generals competed for pieces of his empire. This divided the Greek empire into multiple territories, leading to more Greek civil wars. The divided Greeks' ambitions eventually threatened the rising Roman Republic, which is going to be their downfall. Here's a map of the divided Greek Empire. You can see it's the same territories, but now it's divided 5 ways based on all these military generals of Alexander the Great. I'm going to make a brief mention of this place called Antioch. So there's a city that's founded during this time, around 300 BC, by one of Alexander the Great's best military generals. I believe his name was Antiochus. He establishes this city called Antioch. And by the time of the New Testament, which is about 300 years after this, Antioch had grown into the most important Hellenistic Jewish city. And Hellenistic Judaism, Hellenistic just means Greek, so like Greek-influenced Judaism, is a type of syncretic Judaism, like we were talking about, mixing Greek with Jewish culture. It influenced heavily both Jewish tradition and Greek culture, the combining of those two. Later, the followers of Jesus will first be called Christians, which is why we call ourselves Christians today, at Antioch. So it's a very important city for that side of history. And we're going to talk about a lot more when we get to Acts. So Greek culture will continue as a dominating force in the world. I would argue probably even more than Roman culture. Pretty much all of Roman culture comes from Greek culture. Now Rome, which is from the origin of Rome, we're going to talk about until the New Testament. Beginning around the time of the Bible's book of Judges, long time ago, the Greek-Trojan War was being fought between these competing Greek kingdoms. Very famous war. And the impact of the war and the Bronze Age collapse led to some Greeks to leave their homelands and travel elsewhere. Some went southeast, such as the Philistines, like we talked about after this war. But some refugees from the ancient Trojan War moved northwest to establish a city and a kingdom that was called Latium. And this was in the boot of Italy. If you've seen a map how Italy's a boot, it was in that boot, Latium. And this is the origin of the Latin language. It's an adaptation of the Greek language that turned into Latin. And all our languages today, the major ones like English, Spanish, etc., are all from Latin. So Latium established a royal dynasty that lasted many centuries. And one of the kings of Latium at some point was betrayed, and he was killed by this traitor, this usurper, trying to take the throne for himself, but he was illegitimate. And his daughter survived these events. So his daughter, this guy who was betrayed, the king of Latium, his daughter, a princess, was betrayed also, but she was then impregnated by Mars, who was the Roman god of war. And she gave birth to twins who were named Romulus and Remus. And so they're half god and half human, according to this legend, which I actually believe is true based on what we talked about with the gods when we talked about that a long time ago. She gave birth to these twins, Romulus and Remus. The traitor from Latium tried to have the twins killed by throwing them in a nearby river. But his guards didn't like that. They felt bad for these little baby twins. And so they left the twins just to die on the riverbank. They didn't want to throw them in the river, but they just abandoned them on this riverbank. But then this mother wolf finds the twins and raises them for a short time until they're found by a shepherd. And then the shepherd takes the twins and raises them in this community of shepherds until they're all adults. And then at this point, they learn about their royal heritage, and they go and avenge their grandfather's betrayal. And they take back the throne of Latium once again and restore the rightful lineage. But then after this, the twins decided to establish a new city by the river where they were found and raised by the wolf and the shepherds. And so they got into an argument in the process over how they should name this new city that they set up. And Romulus, in the course of this argument, kills his brother Remus. And so Romulus then names the new city after himself, Rome. Romulus, Rome. And he became the first king of this city, Rome. For 250 years, Rome was ruled by kings after this, descended from Romulus, and the monarchy then eventually abused their power and oppressed the people, as kings usually tend to do. That happens all throughout history. You probably heard that with like England and America. That's how America started. There was an abusive king abusing his power. And so what happened? Well, they rose up, the Roman people rose up and overthrew their king, the monarchy, around 509 BCE. At that time, the Romans established a republic, which is like a democracy. It's very similar to what America has, and it was ruled by a senate. And so we're voting on things now. Now Rome is a democracy. Sounds familiar. The Roman Democratic Republic lasted nearly 500 years. During the end of that time frame, the Romans were successful in expanding their territory in Europe and into the Near East. And they were defeating the Canaanite colonists all over the Mediterranean coastline. So those of you who were here, remember I talked about how the Canaanites were getting pushed out of their land, so they settled on all the coastlands of the sea, the Mediterranean Sea. But now they're coming into conflict with the Romans, and so the Romans are going to start going to war with the Canaanites. The Canaanites actually start the war by betraying a Roman city and hurting it. But the Romans are going to finish it and wipe out the Canaanites. So the Macedonian king, Philip V, allied with a Canaanite general whose name was Hannibal. Once again, that's a very popular movie, Hannibal, about this story. So he was a Canaanite general. In his invasion of Roman territory, this Macedonian king, who was a Greek king, Philip V, he helped Hannibal. And so then one of the smallest enemies of this Greek king, Philip V, asked for Rome's help against him. And the Romans, who of course felt betrayed by the Greeks, agreed to help this small enemy of the Greeks. And because of this, the Romans easily conquered what was left of the Greek Empire. But they do this in stages. And so Rome had two main military generals who were also prominent members of the Senate. They were both responsible for Rome's vast conquests in the land. In the northwest, there was this guy named General Julius Caesar. And in the east, southeast, you had General Pompey. But they were equally important in terms of what they were conquering. They just went in different directions. So General Pompey was eventually invited to conquer Jerusalem, which we'll talk about later. And he crushed the hopes of a continued Jewish independence around 63 BCE. And so many people in Rome elevated General Julius Caesar, as opposed to Pompey, for his greater military victories, because he did do, in Roman people's eyes, Julius Caesar did a bit greater than Pompey did. And so they start elevating him. And the Senate, the people who are voting, make this move to say, Julius Caesar, he should be the dictator over us. He should be the one who makes all the decisions, no more democracy. He should be the emperor of Rome. And this would officially end the Roman Republic and set up a new system of government which revolved around a Roman emperor. But General Pompey and his supporters strongly opposed this shift to give all the government power to Julius Caesar. Rightly so, right? It doesn't seem like such a good idea. This led to a period of civil war between the different Roman political factions, basically those that supported Julius Caesar and those that supported Pompey. And it ended with the defeat of Pompey and his supporters. And so Julius Caesar then, after this though, he gets victory, he gets betrayed and assassinated by being stabbed to death in the Senate building. So the people start to regret giving him all this power, so they stab him to death. But Julius Caesar had already named a nephew, his nephew, Octavian, as a successor to the title of Emperor of Rome, and Octavian then becomes known as Augustus Caesar. He was victorious in crushing the remaining rebellions against his central political authority, and this solidified the official shift from the Roman Republic to the Roman Empire. Roman emperors functioned as the head of state for the next 5 centuries, and they basically had ultimate authority. They were viewed as like gods in the flesh on earth. It was a very bad situation, but it also kept Rome very powerful at the same time. It made the government simple. This also led to a period of peace within the new Roman Empire that was known as Pax Romana, or the Roman peace. And so here's the Roman Empire at its greatest extent. As you can see, they conquered all of Judea, the Holy Land, eventually all of Egypt, all of Persia, although there were Parthians over here. That's the new Persian Empire. They conquered all of Europe, and they even went up into Britain. And so this lays the foundation for modern Europe and all the countries of modern Europe. When Rome falls, it's all going to collapse into chaos and eventually lay the seeds for what will be France and Germany and all the Europeans today. But again, Rome lasts 503 years, united, and that covers the rest of the Bible's history. When we talk about church history and Jewish history, we'll talk about the rest of the years and how Rome got divided and mixed for much longer. Now, last thing about Rome, we need to talk about the origin of crucifixion, which relates to how the Romans perfected it. So, from very ancient times, when armies would conquer a people, they would nail the dead bodies of the leaders of the military, they would nail the dead bodies of the leaders they conquered up onto city walls. And they did this to terrorize the enemy. So they'd see these dead bodies hanging from the city walls so that the people would just surrender. It was brutal back then. And so the Philistines, we see, did this to the first Israelite king, King Saul, and his sons. I mentioned it briefly when we talked about that. The Assyrians, who were masters of cruelty, violence, and torture, realized it was even more effective to do this while their enemies were still alive. This evolved into many different methods of hanging people on wooden structures, such as impalement, which we talked about when we talked about Esther. One of these hanging methods that the Assyrians used was crucifixion, which was tying the hands and feet of their enemies to a tree or a wooden post with ropes. And so crucifixion, being hung upright on a vertical apparatus, caused a slow death by asphyxiation, which is a fancy way of saying you stop breathing and you have a heart attack. You can't breathe it, but slowly, like you slowly, and then you die. The Babylonians introduced this to the Persians, and the Persians used this method of execution more than everyone before them. And I think I skipped over this, but the Assyrians introduced it to the Babylonians, like we talked about in our history, but they used rope. Again, the Babylonians introduced it to the Persians, and then the Persians made it really popular. And so the Persians are the ones who introduced it to the Greeks. And this is a picture of the Persians putting up this Greek king that they conquered. They tied him up, as you can see, on this tree. And they tied one arm going up this way, one arm like bent that way. And you can see he's suffering and they're mocking him and stuff, just to humiliate the king and establish the Persians, we're going to be the kings now. Like, you have to submit to us. That's why they did this. So how did it get even more popular? Well, the Greek conqueror Alexander the Great, who's Greek, introduced this to the Near East, specifically the Canaanites and the Jewish people. And some Jewish leaders actually used crucifixion, as we'll talk about in a moment, against their own people before the time of the New Testament. The Canaanites introduced crucifixion to the Romans in their many wars. And so it was actually the Canaanites who started crucifying Romans, and Romans are like, oh, this is a good idea for establishing dominance. Let's do this. However, the Romans perfected crucifixion and turned it into the most humiliating and painful death possible. And here's how they did it. So they stripped the victims nude, first of all, so that it would be completely humiliating. And when you're hanging up there, it takes a while to die, sometimes days. At least hours, but sometimes days. And while you're there, you still have to go to the bathroom. So you're naked and you're peeing and pooping yourself in front of everybody. Very humiliating, right? But also, before they did that, they would also beat the victims severely before they hung them up. So they're all beaten and bloodied too. They would force victims to carry the heavy crossbar to the site of their crucifixion. So there was a bar that the arms were attached to, and they would force people to carry it to wherever they were being hung up. And so they used these structures called crosses also, because crucifixion wasn't always on crosses. And it spread out the victim's body more, which prolonged the torment, and it also slowed down that process of suffocation. Instead of rope, they also used these huge nails to attach the victim to the cross for added suffering and bloodshed. And sometimes they included other torture devices built into the cross structure. For example, these wooden seats that would make it so the person couldn't breathe all the way, or couldn't do the thing to help themselves breathe. And then sometimes there's evidence that they put these horns in there that would actually rape the men as they're getting as they're trying to breathe. They have to rape themselves. It was really, Romans just brutal what they did with crucifixion. But they learned it from the Canaanites, who learned it from all these other people. So here's an example of someone carrying the crossbar, and they would have to carry it to wherever they would be hung up. And there's different types of crosses too. There was a straight pole, there was a T, there was a little T cross that we're used to, and then actually they used trees sometimes a lot too. Here's an example of someone being crucified on a wooden pole that's straight up. Here's a bunch of people being crucified on T's. And the Romans would do this, where they'd line people up like that and just on crosses, so that everybody there knew, don't mess with us. We're in charge here, don't mess with us. Sometimes they used X's to spread people out on X's like this and crucify them. Sometimes they did to people upside down on crosses. And then sometimes they used a tree just growing out of the ground, and they would just attach the crossbar to a tree. And there's actually debate among Christians if Jesus was crucified on a tree, like an actual literal tree, or if it was like a cross, but man-made cross. And then there's the typical Christian cross that I'm sure you've seen before. So that's Rome. Now Judea, from Persian to Roman province. How's that happen? So, as we talked about last time with Ezra, the priesthood and Levite families that are related to Ezra was a priest, continue to serve as the leading spiritual authority in Judea. And Ezra's influence also gave rise to schools of learning the Torah, which is just a way of saying the Bible, and studying it in depth. So specifically, the Torah is the first 5 books of the Bible. And the Bible has 66 books, so it's just a foundational portion. As empires changed, the priesthood became more political and less spiritual. This led to the corruption of the priesthood, and it also led to competing Jewish and religious political groups or sects among the scholars and elders of the people. So there's different political groups competing among the Jews because of this corrupt priesthood now. And so first what happens is the Greek Empire, right, comes along. They're divided. Actually, when Alexander the Great first conquers Judea, he's very nice to everybody. He says, do whatever you want, have your own government, just give me some taxes. And they already had to do that anyway with Persia. They had to pay taxes to Persia. So he just kept it the same. Very tolerant. But unfortunately, when the empire divided with the generals, the general that took over Judea was like, nah, you guys need to be Greek. You can't be Jewish anymore. You need to be Greek people. So he's trying to force them to speak Greek. He's trying to force them to submit fully and just lose their identity. And the Jewish people are like, no, we have our own history and our own culture. We're not going to do that. So they revolt and go to war against the Greeks. And this is the origin of the story of Hanukkah, which is also called the Feast of Dedication. And you can find that Jesus celebrated it in John chapter 10. And these events caused the leaders of the priesthood, specifically the group that were called the Maccabees or the Hasmoneans, to become kings over the Jewish people in Judea. The problem with this is that these kings were not from David. They were Levites. So what they did is they actually combined the temple, the high priest who's in charge of the temple, and the state. The high priest is now also the king. And that was a big no-no. God said never do that. They were always supposed to be separate, the priest and the king. But they're combining them, temple and state. And that's like combining church and state. And what do we know from history? Very corrupt when that happens. This is not God's will for his people. And this is what leads to the origin of these two different political parties among the Jewish people. One being the Sadducees, the other being the Pharisees. And so the Sadducees supported the priesthood and their non-Davidic kingship. They were for the kings that aren't from David. They were like, forget about David. He's been gone forever. His descendants were judged and put in exile. We're going to be kings now. They were temple-centered, all about the temple, doing sacrifices in the temple. Their whole religion of Judaism was based on the temple. And so they emphasized the sacrificial system from the Torah with only the literal Torah. So they actually believed none of the prophets, none of David, none of that other stuff we studied in the Old Testament. They didn't believe in any of that. Only the Levites and the priests, the first 5 books related to Moses. They focused on the political realities of Judea, such as the government, the money situation, and they were politically conservative like Republicans today in America. They were the Republicans. And they were the upper class, very rich, very wealthy. They were the top 1% of the Jewish population. Then the Pharisees were the ones that opposed the Sadducees. They did not like each other, in fact, hated each other even sometimes. This is important. The Jewish leadership was not united. It's important to understand that. They opposed the non-Davidic kingship of the priesthood. They were common men that had no special background or heritage. They were Torah-centered or Bible-centered. They deeply devoted themselves to God and the Torah like Ezra had done. And they cared about the practical Torah. They really wanted the Torah to be not just literal, but any way that we can make metaphors or anything to make it practical for today, for the common language, for the common people. Make it for today. And so they established synagogues for learning, studying, and doing the Torah. They were Bible scholars. They were politically and religiously liberal. They developed and emphasized the oral Torah, which is not just what the Bible actually says, but commentaries and traditions of, well, what does this mean? And the whole kosher law that we talked about. The Bible says, do not boil a baby goat in its mother's milk, which is very simple. I mean, who's even going to do that today? But Jews today interpret that as you can't eat cheese and meat together. Why is that? Well, the Bible never says that. It's oral tradition. It's oral Torah. And it's because they're trying to apply every law to something that is happening today. The Pharisees are from all social classes. They're not just the rich. But they made up around 5% of the Jewish population by the time of Jesus. And they were more respected and popular than the Sadducees. Most people hated the Sadducees. They were the rich priest class. But the Pharisees, they were the men of the people, the Bible scholars. They would be looked at today like the best Christian pastors who you'd go to for guidance and advice on how to get close to God. And together, the Pharisees and Sadducees made up the Great Sanhedrin, which is this council in Jerusalem of 70 elders. there were different majority leaders. There was basically a president of the Sanhedrin at different times. And sometimes it was a Sadducee, and sometimes it was a Pharisee. And just like with our Congress today, sometimes you have a conservative majority, sometimes you have a liberal majority. And so it changed, and based on that, and they fought each other, just like Republicans and Democrats today, right? Pharisees and Sadducees fought each other. But they had these regular meetings in the Jerusalem temple. It was their Congress in the Second Temple. And their disagreements affected events within the government of Judea. But there were also lesser Sanhedrims, so Sanhedrins is plural in Hebrew, from all over Judea. So Judea was getting bigger. We'll talk about how in a second. But as it did, the Jerusalem one was the main Congress, but then they had these other ones that all reported and sent their votes back to the main one in Jerusalem. And so with that, let's talk about the Levite priest kings of Judea. So the first one was this guy named Simon Thassi. And Simon Thassi did not take the title of king. He took the title of prince on purpose, out of respect for the former kings. And he established, though, this Hasmonean, named after this guy named Hasmon, who was one of the high priests he was descended from, dynasty, the Hasmonean dynasty of kings. And they were the leaders. He was a leader in the Maccabean revolt against the Greek people. And so then his son comes next, Prince John Hyrcanus, and he's the one who really won Judea's independence from the Greeks in the land. And he expanded Judea as a kingdom, an independent kingdom, no longer a vassal, for the first time since before Babylon. And so at first, this John Hyrcanus pacified the Greeks as a loyal vassal. But then he made an alliance with the Roman Republic, who were the enemies of the Greeks by this time. But what do we know about alliances from King Hezekiah that we talked about before, who made an alliance with Babylon? They're not, actually it was Ahaz who did it first, his father. They're not a good idea because they usually can lead to that people taking over you. And that, of course, is what's going to end up happening. But he makes this alliance. He's the first one to ally with Rome when it's a republic to help get leverage against the Greek people. And he expanded Judea by conquering Samaria and Edom and adding them to Judea's territory. He also destroyed the Samaritans' temple and oppressed them, deepening the hatred that existed between the Samaritans that we talked about and the Jewish people. And he forced all the Edomites, because he took control of Edomite, that's the people descended from Esau, Jacob's brother. They were separate for all this time until this guy, John Hyrcanus, forced all the Edomites to convert to Judaism, basically convert or die. And permanently, this mixed the Jewish Edomite bloodline. So there are no Edomites today. All the Edomites from history are now part of the Jewish people. They mixed together. So his son was King Judah Aristobulus I, and he expanded Judea and increased government corruption. His wife was the daughter of a Pharisee, the daughter's name was Alexandra. His wife was Alexandra. So seeking to unite the divided political parties, the Sadducees and the Pharisees, because they had been fighting a lot and it was causing problems for the government. This guy, who was a Sadducee, married the daughter of a Pharisee. Judah married Alexandra. He took advantage of his father's death to seek his own power. He imprisoned his mother and let her starve to death. This is a jacked up guy, Judah Aristobulus. He was officially crowned king of Judea, and so he's no longer a prince. He's now officially a king. And he's the first king since Zedekiah, who is also an illegitimate king. And all these kings here are illegitimate in the eyes of the Bible. Not in the eyes of history, though, because they were kings in history. He expanded Judea northward by conquering Galilee, which was separate, still belonged to the Greeks. So he conquered Galilee, made it part of Judea, and he added this northern territory to his kingdom. And he had no children due to his wife's conspiracy. His youngest brother, named Jonathan, became king when he died. And so this guy, Jonathan, became King Alexander Yanai. And he conspired with his sister-in-law to take the throne from his elder brother. He married his sister-in-law, Alexandra, in accordance with the Jewish law. He had 2 children with Alexandra. Her brother was a Pharisee, Simon. So this is the Alexandra I was talking about in the previous slide. So Simon's sister, Alexandra, is very involved in all these politics of these priest kings. He expanded the independent kingdom of Judea to its greatest extent. He really made Judea like an empire, this Alexander Yanai. He went to war with the Pharisees over the controversy of his priest-king status because he was becoming very tyrannical. So the Pharisees organized a rebellion against him and the Sadducees, but he defeats the Pharisees, capturing 800 of them. He killed the families of these 800 Pharisees, So he killed their families and he crucified them publicly. So as the 800 Pharisees suffered on their crosses, he hosted a party to celebrate, and he watched them die while he was feasting at this party with all these people. So this guy was really sick, but he was also efficient from a political standpoint. He became hated naturally by the Jewish people for his cruelty, and after being politically humiliated, he was forced out of Jerusalem by his wife and her brother. He died in a battle in the northeast part of the kingdom, and his wife succeeded him as queen of Judea and worked with her brother to reestablish the power of the Pharisees in the Sanhedrin, because obviously it was dominated by Sadducees at this point. So this is the kingdom of Alexander Yanai. It's the farthest that Judea will ever be expanded in this period. And here's a comparison when we talked about David. It's not as great as what David did. This is what David did. But it's still pretty good. Like he really, and they're independent too. They're not paying taxes to anybody. But their own government, the high priests and everything, they're very tyrannical over the people. So then this Queen Alexandra, she has these two sons with a former king. And these two sons are named Hyrcanus and Aristobulus. Both of them are named after former kings. So at first she separated the role of priest and king using her sons, which was a smart thing to do. Hyrcanus became the new high priest, and after him, the Sanhedrin changed the succession so that the high priest would become an elected position, limiting the power of the priesthood, which again had become very corrupt. Aristobulus was originally chosen to become the king after his mother died. The Pharisees and Sadducees continued their conflict with each other through the manipulation of Hyrcanus and Aristobulus. To prevent the Sadducees from regaining power, she disinherited Aristobulus, because Aristobulus was supported by Sadducees and he was for them, and chose her other son, Hyrcanus, supported by Pharisees, to become the king after she died. Her son, Hyrcanus, became the new priest king after her death, and this just goes to show that she herself was a hypocrite because she's confusing her own sons with the way she's doing the succession. And then King Hyrcanus II, along with his mother and their supporting Pharisee party, he relied too much on foreign military alliances for success in controlling Judea. In bitterness over Judea's government corruption, one of the top military generals, who is this guy named Antipater, turned Judea's military against Hyrcanus II and forced him to abandon the throne. They deposed him. And Antipater was an Edomite. He was not Jewish by blood, but he had been forced with his parents to convert to Judaism by that guy John Hyrcanus that we talked about. Despite this, Antipater and his family were never fully accepted into Jewish society in Judea because everybody knew they're not Jews by blood, they're Edomites. And so there was racism against him. He won the hearts of all the oppressed foreign citizens of Judea, since the foreign population by this time was 40%. So even though Judea had this great kingdom, almost half of them were non-Jewish and being forced to be Jewish by the kingdom. So Antipater joined with the Sadducees and made Hyrcanus II's brother, again Aristobulus, the new priest king. So it's going to go back and forth between these two brothers, and it's going to keep going this way. So King Aristobulus II stole the throne from his brother through the support of Antipater's Judean military. He ignored Antipater's advice to kill his brother to prevent another coup. He was betrayed by Antipater when Antipater decided he would not be loyal to him. So Antipater used his connections through the Arabs, because Antipater's wife was an Arabian noblewoman, to conspire with Hyrcanus II, again the other brother that he helped depose, to take back the throne from King Aristobulus II. All these things eventually led Judea to lose their independence and much of their territory to the Romans. So this is the civil war of two Levite priest-king brothers now. So led by the successful and renowned Edomite military general, again Antipater, he's kind of at the center of all this. Former priest king Hyrcanus II and his Pharisee supporters were locked in warfare at Jerusalem in an attempt to overthrow priest king Aristobulus II and his Sadducee supporters. A terrible desert storm delayed their fighting, creating the need for both sides of the civil war to seek help from a foreign military power. So who do you think they choose? The new rising star in the region, which is the Romans. And so the Romans had just defeated the short-lived Armenian Empire, which I'm not even going to talk about because it's so short-lived, but this is the actual Armenians, not the Arameans. So the Armenians today are descended from those people. They had an empire for a short time. The Romans wiped them out, and then they were settled at the borders of the weakened kingdom of Judea. Both sides of the civil war between the Levite priest kings began sending messengers to the Romans asking for Roman support for one side over the other. looks really bad for the Jewish people. They're divided against themselves and asking Rome to help them beat each other. So the Romans initially supported priest-king Aristobulus II and the Sadducees, temporarily giving them victory over Hyrcanus II and the Pharisees. And so through this, the Judeans are welcoming Rome's occupation. The civil war continues with Antipater fighting Hyrcanus II and the Pharisees to regain power. Both sides of the civil war, again, a second time, send messengers to the Romans. This time they sent the messengers to the prestigious Roman general and conqueror Pompey the Great, who we talked about before, who was in Damascus at this time. So at first, Pompey refused to take a side and remained neutral. Good man. But then the priest-king Aristobulus II, who was the Sadducees king, threatened Pompey to try to force him and his support in his reign over Judea. So Aristobulus' reign over Judea. In response to this, Pompey sided with priest-king Hyrcanus II and helped Antipater's forces conquer Jerusalem, and they overthrew Aristobulus II. And the Sadducees resisted this Roman takeover, which led to the loss of 12,000 Sadducees. They were slaughtered by the Romans. But there's still Sadducees, but it really weakened their power. At this point, Judea is going to become a Roman vassal. So Pompey helped Judea take a small coastal piece of territory that they hadn't had before. But he says, in exchange for that, how about you give Rome direct control over 10 cities in the northeast territory? So they did this, and this territory became known as the Decapolis. And Jesus is going to do a lot of his ministry there. Same with his disciples. That's why I'm mentioning it. So after Aristobulus II surrendered, Pompey gave the role of priest-king back to Hyrcanus II. However, he began to take away Judea's independence in the process. It happened kind of slowly, but quickly at the same time. The priest-king's role was now greatly restricted, and Judea is officially now a vassal of the Roman Republic, which again, that means that no longer is the money of the people going to the government of the people. Now it's going to a foreign government. Jewish money is now going to the Roman people. So to prevent a full Roman takeover of the government, Hyrcanus II and Aristobulus II finally made peace by having their son and daughter get married to each other. And through this union, they had a granddaughter who's named Mariamne. She became the heir to this non-Davidic throne over Judea. And she's the last one. Mariamne, she's a woman, but she's the heir to the priest-king dynasty. Now Antipater starts to take over here. He's this treacherous Edomite Jew, but he was betrayed by the Jewish people not betrayed, but they were racist against him and his family, and so he's very bitter, obviously. And so he's using his intelligence as a military general to assert his power in the land. He switched sides constantly, like we talked about, and he determined really which side would win. He was at the center of everything, kind of like Emperor Palpatine in Star Wars, if you're familiar with that. That was Antipater at this point. He's playing for both sides. Whatever side will help him take over. So Antipater was the main representative of Judea to the Roman conqueror, Pompey the Great. And they were initially friends, Pompey and Antipater. But Pompey betrayed Antipater by allowing the Romans to plunder the temple in Jerusalem. Antipater had respect for God in the temple in Jerusalem. So he's like, that's not okay that Rome did that. So now he's going to try to betray Pompey. And he does. So Antipater betrays Pompey and turns to support Julius Caesar when Julius Caesar and Pompey are fighting in that Roman civil war that eventually turns Rome into an empire. And so when Antipater proved his loyalty to the new emperor Julius Caesar, Caesar granted him Roman citizenship, which was a big deal, gave him ultimate power in the land. After Caesar's assassination, Antipater fell out of favor with the other Roman powers and political forces around him. And so because of this, Antipater was also assassinated. But before his death, Antipater used his influence in Judea and Rome to arrange a marriage between his son Herod and the heir to the Levite priest-king dynasty from Hyrcanus II and Aristobulus II, which was their granddaughter named Mariamne. So basically, Antipater arranged so that Mariamne, the last heir to that priest-king dynasty, would marry his son Herod. And when Antipater died, Herod became the new military leader of Judea. So Herod was corrupt and opportunistic. With his father's guidance, he divorced his first wife and abandoned their son. So he was already married to a non-Jewish woman, but he abandoned them and his family so that he could marry Mariamne and establish this connection with the priesthood royalty in Judea. The Sanhedrin had also condemned Herod to death for murder. He was misusing his authority as a military general. He was kind of corrupt. But his father-in-law, who was the priest-king Alexander II at that time, pardoned him. And at this point, the Parthian Empire, which is the new Persian Empire that's much weaker than the first one, comes in and takes over the Roman province of Judea and made it their own for a short time. Herod and Mariamne remained loyal to the Romans, so they escaped Judea and ran away to Rome before the Parthians could capture and kill them. Herod and Mariamne eventually made it to the city of Rome, where they both appeared before the Senate. Mariamne at this point expected to be named queen in line with her heritage from the priest kings of Judea, but instead the Romans chose her husband Herod to become the new puppet king of Judea. By this time, the role of king over Judea was a figurehead and a puppet role beneath the real power that was the Roman Empire. With help from the Romans, Herod conquered Jerusalem and officially began reigning as King Herod the Great. And this is the King Herod of the Bible. So hopefully you're seeing all that connection. I know that was a lot, but I want you to see, how do we get all these? There's a lot of new people in the New Testament that are going to get together to crucify Jesus. And I'm telling you all this so that you'll know these are who these people are, and this is where they come from. That's the origin of King Herod the Great. Now, King Herod was a madman. He regularly killed his relatives based on his whims and paranoia. Probably had a lot of mental illness. King Herod was hated by his own people even before he became king, and after he became king, he excessively taxed his people. He built grand structures and bankrupted Judea. He built the port of Caesarea to honor the emperor. So Caesarea, where Jesus is going to do ministry as well, he built that. Eventually, King Herod conspired to kill his wife, his sons that came through his wife, and the entire royal family of the Levite priest kings before her. So he wipes out that entire priest-king dynasty, their whole family. They're gone now because of Herod. And King Herod used his corrupt Essene agent in the Sanhedrin to condemn his wife to death for a crime she didn't commit. So he bribed this person to basically falsely accuse her and kill her. And that was the death of Mariamne, the last heir to the priest kings. And so the supporters of King Herod's new royal dynasty were called Herodians. And I mention that because they're going to call themselves Christians, the follower of Jesus, because they're not Herodians. They're against Herod. They're for the Messiah, Christ. So King Herod's atrocities helped unite the great Sanhedrin, the Sadducees and the Pharisees, against him because they both really didn't like him. So led by two new competing schools of thought among the Pharisees, named Hillel and Shammai, King Herod refused to name a clear successor before his death, which was very dumb, and he divided Judea into 4 sections and planned for 4 different relatives to inherit one of these sections. When one of his sons, who is also named Herod, he has like 4 sons named Herod, actually 3, tried to contest this decision to the Roman emperor. So one of his sons is like, I don't like this. He goes to Rome and he says, can you help me? Like, my father's dumb. Like, he's trying to like divide. I want to be the only heir. Instead of helping him, the Romans enforce Herod's dumb decision and break Judea into 4 different sections, which just weakens them even further. And furthermore, the Roman emperor declared that these territories would have rulers with no successor, meaning that all the territories of Judea would go from being vassals to full-fledged Roman territory within the next generation. So at this point, actually, Judea wasn't a Roman province yet. They were just paying taxes to the Romans. It was getting worse and worse. And now, because of this decision, they're going to become just part of Rome. They're not going to be free at all anymore. The Roman emperor declared that the great Sanhedrin would be the new highest authority in the land, so a democracy, but only under Rome. So that's why we get Pontius Pilate and all the other Roman governors that are going to come in, and they're the ultimate authority now. So, the evil Herodian dynasty. So King Herod the Great's sons continued his wickedness and were puppets of the Roman Empire. They were known as the Judean Tetrarchy. There was Herod Archelaus, who was over Judea, and this was the main territory with the capital city of Jerusalem. Then there was Herod Antipas over Galilee, Herod Philip over Britannia, Salome I over Jamnia. Those are the 4 territories. But when each of those people died, all of those territories became directly Roman territory. On the day that Archelaus, the first one who was over Judea and Jerusalem, on the day Archelaus was crowned in Jerusalem as the new king of the Jews in the Tetrarch of Judea, many people protested his legitimacy. In response, he crucified 3,000 protesters in the Jerusalem temple on Passover. So not only did he crucify these 3,000 Jewish protesters, but he crucified them in the temple on Passover, on one of the holiest days of the Jewish year. So Herod is evil. The great Sanhedrin hated him, so they demanded Archelaus abdicate from the throne and go into exile in Roman territory in Gaul, which was like modern-day France, way far away. And so the Romans listen. He's forced to go into exile. But after this, Judea officially became a province of the Roman Empire, and the Roman governor was sent to rule over them as the highest authority in the land. The Great Sanhedrin continued to exist, but it was totally limited and forced to submit to the decisions of the Roman governors. The Romans began charging crushing property taxes on all the Jewish people in the land, because before this, Jews did not have or believe in property tax. They thought it was evil to tax people for their property. They only taxed income. So if you're not making any money, you don't have to pay any taxes. That's a good system, right? Not the Romans. We don't care how poor you are. If you own property of any kind, you have to pay taxes. And so this is crushing the people now. So the Jewish people suffered under Roman control, and some began to plot rebellions naturally because of this. And so a Pharisee member of the Sanhedrin named Judah of Galilee had direct ancestry going back to King David. Using this status, Judah of Galilee led a group of Pharisee supporters in military resistance against the Roman governor in an attempt to overthrow Roman rule in Judea. This guy, Judah of Galilee, he failed to beat the Romans, but he survived. And he started a new movement of followers that became known as the Zealots. And the Zealots used violence and terrorist attacks with like knives. They didn't have bombs back then, but they just suddenly stabbed people out of nowhere. To weaken Roman power in the land, they emphasized the need for a descendant of David to come, overthrow the Romans, and establish a kingdom of David once again. And so those are the Zealots. Meanwhile, the priesthood is still very powerful, but they're in Rome's pocket now. The Roman Empire controlled Jerusalem. The Roman governors directly actually appointed high priests now. So no longer is there any freedom in who's going to be the high priest. It's totally controlled by Rome. In only 14 years, Rome went through 8 different high priests. Out of these, 3 of the high priests only lasted 1 year. And so to be a high priest, then at this time, you have to just be a puppet to the Romans. Give the Romans whatever they want, oppress the people, and just be a horrible person. Finally, the Romans found a high priest that supported their needs in a man named Joseph, son of Caiaphas, and he finally lasts a long time. This is the guy who's popularly known as Caiaphas, the high priest that condemns Jesus to die. These are the political parties, the 5 political parties at the time. We talked about the Sadducees. We talked about the Pharisees, but I'll comment that the Pharisees, by Jesus' time, which is now, are divided into 2 different types of Pharisees. There's Pharisees that supported Hillel, and they believed in mercy and the heart of the law, which is important to understand. So Jesus' teachings actually never upset or made anyone angry from Hillel. Or maybe they did, but only the most controversial ones. The people from Hillel, they loved the things Jesus was saying. There's a lot of Pharisees from Hillel followed Jesus. But Shammai, on the other hand, he was a legalist. It has to be the letter of the law, everything down to the line. Very strict. And so Shammai actually was still alive. You'll meet him you probably met him in The Chosen if you've watched The Chosen show. Shammai's in it. Shammai's in it, and he wants to kill Jesus. Hillel had just died, and so one of Hillel's descendants is around in Jesus' time, but Hillel dies, I think, when Jesus was young, teenager. Then the Zealots that I just talked about, the terrorists. And then you have this group called the Essenes that lived in caves and separated themselves from society. Well, these are the people, I mentioned them because these are the Jewish people at the time that are saying the end of the world is coming. Like there's people like that today. So that was them back then, the Essenes. They also didn't believe in like going to the bathroom on the Sabbath. So they would like hold it all day, and they were kind of weird. So the point of all this is to say it's a new time, but it's the same problem that we talked about in Ezra and Nehemiah. There's conflict between different Jewish people from different places. The Jewish leadership does not know how to properly lead the Jewish people in righteousness. Their best is not good enough. The Jewish leadership maintains devotion to God, but with corrupt hearts. And the Jewish people, they don't understand God's righteousness or his will, and so they need God himself to come and bring righteousness and renew their covenant with him. They need a new covenant. Second Temple Judaism, just some quick things about shifts in worldview. So now we have actual Judaism. In the Old Testament, there wasn't really Judaism. There's strict monotheism, which is only one God. There's a total rejection of paganism, no more worshiping any other gods. Before that, the Jewish people believed one God was greater than all the other gods, at least, but they would also worship many other gods, and there was a lot of paganism. But now there's actual Judaism for the first time. So leaders like Ezra and Nehemiah, they set the foundation for this Second Temple Judaism. There was Persian syncretism that came in. So Zoroastrianism, which is this religion from the Persians that believed in a war between light and darkness. Everything is a war between light and darkness. People didn't think that way before. But now the Jews are going to start thinking that way. So we have angelic agents locked in this heavenly warfare between good and evil, between light and darkness. So that comes into Judaism through the Persians there. Good versus evil. Greek syncretism. There's Hellenism. The Greek culture becomes dominant, and the elites, the richest people, preferred to be more Greek, which included not circumcising yourselves, because the Greeks thought circumcision was horrible. And then they have this belief of the eternal soul, because before this, people believed that when you died, you're dead. So there's not really this idea of heaven and hell in the same way in the Old Testament. There is an idea of resurrection, that you'll rise from the dead, but there's not this idea of heaven and hell. That came from Greek thinking and this dualistic idea of afterlife, heaven and hell, so that we have that now. There's new Jewish writings. The book of Maccabees and the books of Enoch are an example, and they're called second canon or deuterocanon books. They're not going to be put in the Bible, but they are in Catholic Bibles. There's also this apocalyptic worldview that the end is near, God's kingdom is coming, and that's very popular among the people, especially the Essenes, but also others. And the two Yahwehs idea in the Bible that we talked about leads to this idea that one of these Yahwehs is known as the Memra, or the Logos. Different language, Aramaic Memra, Greek Logos. But this is the Word of God, who is God, but is also the God revealing himself physically to people, because they would say God himself is too great to reveal himself except through another version of also himself that can be revealed in like a smaller way so that people can contain it. And so that idea is already in the Bible, but it becomes even more talked about in the Jewish writings. And then the idea of the Son of Man is a major title for the Messiah. It starts with Daniel, but now it's a major title, Son of Man, Messiah. And then the idea of the branch or root, which is Nazarene, is a major title for the Messiah from the book of Isaiah, particularly, and other prophets. We'll talk about that more later. And major developments also in the theological expression of spiritual beings. There's no more gods anymore, because before there's many different gods. And they were. It wasn't like, oh, they're not. No, there were many different gods. But now, no, we're not going to call them gods anymore. Now they're angels, which is all spiritual beings who have all these powers, but they're not God. They were created by God. Also the idea of an angelic rebellion, which led to spiritual evil in heavenly places, and the related idea of God having an archenemy, leading to these angels and demons. And so these ideas didn't exist in the same way before this. And then there's this new view, I already mentioned it, the Jewish afterlife. Originally, it was called Sheol. It's the underworld, where whoever you are, whether you're good or evil, that's where you go when you die. This place called Sheol, where nothing's really happening. It's not fun down there. Everybody's just bored. But then, no, really, though, that was kind of how it's portrayed. But then there were people like David and Job who were believing in a resurrection. Like, God's not just going to leave us in that place where we're just sat in the dust, bored. He's going to raise us from the dead, and we're going to be on earth again and live again. And so now you have the idea of Sheol, the underworld, having separate compartments. So it's not just one place. There's different parts of it, a part of paradise and a part of torment. And now you have a place of paradise called the Garden of Eden. That's what the Jews called the place of paradise. And a place of torment, which was called Hades by the Greeks, but then other Jews called it Gehenna, which I would comment more on if we have more time, but ask me later if you're curious about how that relates to hell, because it's pretty interesting. There's also this place of experiential darkness outside God's kingdom that's connected to that, and there's a place of fiery judgment at the very end associated with the Valley of Hinnom, which comes from the place where they sacrificed children in the Old Testament. So eventual resurrection from the dead and a final judgment for all people is what the Jewish people believed in ultimately. But before that, they adopted all these other ideas that really didn't start with the Jewish people or the Hebrews. It came from other places. I'm not saying it's not true. I'm just saying that it didn't come from the Jewish people. Okay, John the Baptist. So John the Baptist was the son of Zechariah and Elizabeth, who were married and grew old together, but they could not have children no matter how hard they tried, following the Bible's pattern. This happens a lot. Zechariah was John's father. He was a Levite. They were both Levites, actually, and one of the priests who served in the holy place of the temple. But Zechariah, he was a good guy. He was a good Levite. The angel Gabriel appeared to him to proclaim God's miracle of giving him a son. He did not believe, though, at first, so he was mute until after John was born. Gabriel gave him John's name beforehand and told him John would be a Nazarite who is filled with the Holy Spirit from the womb. And remember, Nazarites are the ones that grow their hair really long. They can't cut their hair and they can't drink wine. And so John the Baptist was a Nazarite from the womb his whole life. Gabriel told him John would be the herald of the eternal Messiah of Israel. And he prophesied and glorified God after John was born. So Zechariah believes after it has been mute for 9 months, and then God opens his mouth and he praises God. Elizabeth, John's mother, also a Levite, specifically from the daughters of Aaron, Moses' brother Aaron, and she was a faithful woman. She miraculously became pregnant as an old woman. They were very old when she became pregnant with John. Her relative was Mary, the virgin mother of Jesus. And this means, just as a side note, that Mary had Levite heritage on one of the sides of her family, and a heritage going back to King David from the tribe of Judah. So Mary actually had both. That's important. She was filled with the Holy Spirit, and John's fetus leaped in her womb when Mary visited her when Jesus was in Mary's womb. So they were pregnant, visit each other, and John the Baptist's fetus leaps in the womb, is all excited about Jesus being near. So Zechariah's martyrdom. When John was around 2 years old, King Herod tried to kill every single toddler and baby in the land based on the messianic prophecy about Bethlehem. It was revealed to him. As we know, King Herod was very evil. I talked about him. So to help protect his family, Zechariah stood against King Herod and distracted him from finding Elizabeth, John, Joseph, Mary, and Jesus. So he saved all their lives by distracting King Herod. When he realized he was tricked by Zechariah, King Herod had the priest Zechariah dragged out of the temple and stoned to death. Thus, John's father was killed when he was only a toddler. So John was forced to leave the cities of Judea, and he grew up in the wilderness, possibly as part of the Essene community, those wild ones we were talking about. It's debated. We don't know for sure. But God revealed himself to John from a young age, and John became a mighty prophet. And he was the first prophet since Malachi. John preached the usual prophet's message of repentance, so return to God from sin, and announced that the kingdom of God was close. John had the same type of influence as the prophet Elijah. Many people left their lives behind and followed John as disciples. John gave his audience a unique sign to help announce God's coming kingdom, baptism, and it was the dunking or immersing the entire body into water, baptism. So, before John, there was a priestly ritual called the mikveh. The priests had to dunk themselves in a special pool or bath of still, unmoving water that came from a natural source, so like rainwater. The water could not be flowing, so the priests would do this. They had these holy little baths. They went in, they would dunk themselves in. That happened. But John, he proclaimed a new type of mikveh, dunking into flowing, moving, living water. So the idea is come alive spiritually. Don't be dead and stagnant. And so John's baptism was a sign of true repentance from sin in the heart. It's a sign of being reborn in a spiritual way. It was a sign of coming alive, flowing like the river water on the inside, turning the heart. Because that's what Malachi said. He will turn the heart of the fathers to the sons and the sons to the fathers. So this is why they called him John the Baptist. Throughout his life, John had proclaimed the soon coming of the eternal Messiah. To fulfill God's plan, Jesus comes and is baptized by John the Baptist. John witnessed before all his disciples and those who came to see him that Jesus was the Lamb of God who came to take away the sin of the world. John witnessed the Holy Spirit descend onto Jesus like a dove from heaven, and he heard the Father speak directly to Jesus as the Son of God. From this point forward, John intentionally became less active in his ministry, and he told all his disciples to start following Jesus. He specifically has this quote that was famous a while back. There was on shirts like, "He is greater than I." I don't know if you guys remember those, but John says, "He must increase, Jesus must increase, I must decrease." So some of John's disciples listened and said, yeah, Jesus is the Messiah, like Andrew, Peter's brother Andrew. But not all of them listened. So John continued preaching righteousness and pointing people to Jesus. He was eventually put in prison and beheaded by the new King Herod, different Herod, the son of the king, though, that killed his father. But the Mandaeans, who most people don't even know about, were John's misguided followers. They were disciples of John that did not believe his testimony in Jesus of Nazareth as the Messiah. And instead, these disciples developed their own teaching based on what they learned from John the Baptist. And this is the origin of a very ancient religion that very few people know about called Mandaeism or Sabaeanism. The religion is named after the Aramaic word that means baptizers. So it's all about baptism. The Mandaeans or Sabaeans believe that John the Baptist was the last true prophet from God, kind of like how the Muslims view Muhammad and kind of like how Mormons view Joseph Smith. Around 100,000 Mandaeans still exist today. Mandaeanism is a Gnostic religion, which means it's focused on secret spiritual knowledge. They inspired other Gnostic groups that would develop in Christianity in the future. We'll discuss Gnosticism later when we talk about Christian history. Mandaeans believe the most important spiritual act is baptism, and they practice it regularly as a means to grow closer to God and gain salvation through baptism. And it must be, they say, in a flowing river. It has to be in a river. You can't baptize in a pool, in an ocean. It has to be in a river that's flowing. The Mandaeans have a long history going all the way back to the New Testament. They never carry weapons or fight back when attacked. They're pacifists. They believe everything is a spiritual war between light and darkness. And eventually they all settled in Iraq. All this stuff's going to happen that's going to force all Jewish people out. So they all settled in Iraq, which was Babylon. It's now Iraq today. And they all lived in Iraq until the Iraq War, just back in 2003, when many of us here were alive. I think actually all of us here were alive at that time. So at this point, the Muslims tried to force them to convert to Islam or die, but they took their faith very seriously, so they didn't convert to Islam. Most of them. Between 2003 and 2011, the Mandaeans were forced to leave their homes in Iraq and settle as foreigners in other countries in the Middle East, throughout Europe, in Australia, and in the United States. The highest population today is in Sweden. Okay, the Messiah, Christ. Christ is not a last name. I've said that before, but it's important. So Christ is a Greek term that's equivalent, the same, as the Hebrew term Messiah. What does it mean in English? They usually translate it anointed one. That's very disconnected still. A disconnected translation is a bad translation, in my opinion. If you can't understand it, no good. Chosen one. That's a better understanding. You think of, for those of you who have seen Star Wars, Anakin is the chosen one, right? He's the chosen one. He has a destiny to be a hero and to rule. Specifically in the type of Messiah as a king. So chosen one. That's what the Messiah is. There were many Messiahs in the Old Testament. We talked about this already, but just a reminder as we think about Jesus as Messiah. There were prophets that were all chosen by God to be his representative to the world. They were all Messiahs. There was Israel, who as an entire nation, God's chosen nation, is called his son and is called the Messiah by the Hebrew Bible, the Old Testament. And Aaron, Moses' first brother, who is the first high priest of Israel, establishes that the Messiah is the priest. Saul and David, the first two kings of the United Kingdom, were called Messiah. And Cyrus, a Gentile king of Persia who conquered Babylon and helped the Jews return home. He's also called Messiah. And the prophets foretold, though, that there would be one final Messiah, one last Messiah, who would establish God's kingdom on earth by bringing all people back to the paradise of the Garden of Eden, where all people lived in the beginning with God. This Messiah is the Messiah. In one man, he will fulfill the three most important roles of Israel's government in the Old Testament. The prophet, who embodies God to the world in actions and words. The priest, which is the one who presents the people's sacrifice, the perfect sacrifice to God. And the king, who conquers the enemies of God's people and establishes peace, prosperity, and paradise. And so this coming final Messiah will be called by three different son of names. Son of Adam, or son of man, Adam being the first human. Son of David, the greatest Jewish king, and son of God. So the Messiah for the Jewish people back then is like end times for Christianity today. Everybody's talking about when's it going to happen? When's it, maybe in big thing right now is 2030. Oh, Jesus is coming back in 2030, the end of the world. Da, da, da. It's been like this forever, but this was like what the Messiah was for the Jewish people in the time that we're talking about, this 400 years that I talked about tonight. There's endless Jewish debates about the Messiah during that time and leading up to Jesus, and even afterwards. We believe that Jesus is the Messiah as Christians, but not all Jewish people believe that, and to this day, Jewish people are still waiting for the coming of the Messiah. And that is a lot of information, but keep all of it in mind, not all of it, but the highlights at least, as we go into talking about the gospel next week in the story of Jesus.